Hello, everybody. It's James Rusher. Today, we're going to be talking about the podcast algorithm, which is hosted by Ben Kuebrich. And this is about the case of a young woman, 19-year-old woman named Afrikka Hardy. And we're going to be basically dissecting how this podcast and how Keubrich looks at this story of Afrikka Hardy. And we're going to look at a couple questions here. We're going to be looking at three main things. In addition to just looking at the case and basically what happened with it, we're also going to be diving into the case, analyzing it, and determining whose story really matters in the end. In this case, whose story matters? Is it Afrikka's or is it someone else's? And then we're going to be looking at whose story do we believe, because there's a lot of information that isn't known in this story. There's also some points of views, some assumptions that maybe have to be made. So we're going to be looking at whose story do we actually believe. And finally, who gets justice in the end? Not just from the case and what happened and the outcome of the case, but also the way that the story is told by Keubrich in the podcast. Who is he really focusing on, and who gets justice in the end? Who feels justified by this story, and especially the way that this story is told? So first, we're going to be looking at the case itself, give a little bit of background information. So once again, this case is on a young woman, 19-year-old woman named Afrikka Hardy, who initially grew up in Chicago, and then her parents split and she moved with her mom over to Denver. But finances were very difficult for them. It was troubling times. It was hard to find work for her mother. And so Afrikka gave up her dreams to go to college. She did very well in high school, very intelligent, but she gave up her dreams to go to college. She actually moved back to Chicago with her father. And there she was doing it, okay at first. The finances were still hard, but then eventually she started she was living a little bit well. She was a little well off after a while of being back in Chicago away from Denver. And her mother, her mother's name is Lori Townsend, her mother didn't really get suspicious of it. Her mother didn't get suspicious at first because she just thought that, her daughter was a hardworking young woman, that she was just working hard, and that there was nothing secret, nothing crazy going on that would allow her to, kind of get out of the financial rut that her family was in and basically improve circumstances for her in such a short period of time. Her mother didn't really think there was anything crazy about that. But then there was one day, it was the last time that Lori and her daughter communicated, which was actually over Facebook Messenger. They shot a couple messages to each other throughout the day, but then eventually later in the day, Afrikka stopped responding. They didn't talk for the rest of the day. And this was because Afrikka actually went from Chicago. She went about 45 miles southeast, mostly east, from Chicago over to Gary, Indiana, up by Lake Michigan in Gary, northwest Indiana. And the only person at the time who knew where Afrikka was her friend Shamika, that was also in the area and traveling with Afrikka. So her friend Shamika was the only one that knew that Afrikka had made the journey from Chicago to Gary, Indiana at that time later that day. And this is actually where Afrikka ends up dying. She ends up dying in Gary. So what ultimately happened was that Afrikka had become a prostitute. And this is how she was able to, acquire a little bit of wealth quite quickly, is because she was selling herself to clients, as they call them, clients. And Shamika was basically her manager. She was the one that set up all the client work, got the clientele, did advertising, things like that, and was able to get Afrikka clients and basically generate revenue for both of them. Shamika was her manager in that regard. And basically after the fact, Lori talked to Shamika about it because someone else in Lori's family basically said, hey, you need to call this person right away. It's about Afrikka, and you need to call this person because they're the only one that has any information on it. And basically the conclusion that Lori comes to after hearing Shamika's story and what she was willing to tell to Lori, she did tell her about the prostitution, what was going on and what ended up happening. Basically the conclusion that Lori came to her mother was that something more could have been done. That there was something that was missing, something that she didn't see, that she should have seen, something that the police could have done, that the police should have done to prevent this, or basically to prevent the criminal from acting, because it does end up being a serial killing. This is the act of a serial killer who went on multiple killings, and basically Lori comes to the conclusion something more could have been done. I feel like something more could have been done. And so that's one of the reasons why she agreed to talk to Ben Kuebrich, the host of this show, about this, because she wanted to get the story out. She wanted to spread the information so that things like this, stories like this, don't happen again. She doesn't want other people to feel the same pain and trauma that she felt, and she wanted people to basically know this and hopefully prevent things like this from happening again. So in this podcast, basically, the host, Ben Kuebrich, who was originally only a producer, this was actually the first podcast that he actually hosted and talked on throughout the entire time. He's usually a producer. But he starts out with interviewing Lori, right? Interviewing Lori, getting her side of the story, and seeing what she knows and what he can learn about Afrikka's past, her story leading up to her death. But then he kind of moves in a little bit of a different direction, because in essence, Afrikka's case, Afrikka's story, was sort of the missing puzzle piece. The missing puzzle piece in an algorithm, a pattern, a system, a program that a man named Thomas Hargrove was working on. And what Hargrove did was he was collecting all this crime data, all this individual, it's called the Supplemental Homicide Report. It was one of the items he worked with, which lists a bunch of individual crimes, individual homicide crimes from the FBI. And he was trying to develop a computer program that could link similar cases together, similar clusters of cases based on age, race, where it was located, things like that, weapon used. And he was trying to link these together to try and find possible serial killings, because serial killings was not something that the police really looked at this time. This was when Hargrove started working on it, it was in the 90s, and then eventually led into the early 2000s when Afrikka's case happened. And that was basically what Keubrich transitioned into first. He went from interviewing Lori and getting Afrikka's side of the story, and then he started seeing, well, how does Afrikka's story fit into and link into Hargrove's story, into the algorithm that he's developing, and how Afrikka's story was used to basically complete the algorithm and allow the police to go and find Darren Vann, who was the serial killer that ended up killing Afrikka Hardy, as well as numerous other women, young and old, but numerous other women, pretty much all by strangulation was the way, the means of murder. And so once he figures out how Afrikka's story fits into Hargrove's story with the algorithm, he looks at how the algorithm is applied to find Darren Vann, to find out, and then eventually find out his story and his motives for why he was doing what he was doing, why he was killing, what his motivation behind it was, and basically the link between his killings. And this is, it's a bit interesting because it's kind of, the podcast transitions from one story into another, but as you know, the name of the podcast is titled Algorithm. So really, he only spends the first couple episodes diving into Afrikka Hardy's story and dissecting what is going on with that, what events led up to her death, what could have possibly been the reason that this happened. He only spends the first couple episodes on that, and it's a 13-episode podcast. So he only spends the first 2 episodes really on that, and then transitions from Afrikka's case into how it fits into the algorithm and how the algorithm was developed, and Hargrove's story. And then for the vast majority of the latter half of the podcast, he talks about Darren Vann's story and how the algorithm was used to find Vann, but then goes into multiple episodes talking about Vann's story, how he worked through the killings that he did, and again, basically the motivations and what led him to do this. And then ultimately, how did Afrikka's case fit into the algorithm that allowed the police to find Vann? So we're going to dive into, basically that's the background. We're going to dive into the three core questions, and we're going to start with whose story matters. So whose story really matters, whose story is depicted the most from this specific telling of the narrative of Afrikka Hardy and the algorithm in Darren Vann's serial killings? It's an interesting question, because how do you determine whose story matters the most when there's multiple stories being told at the same time, in sequence of each other? Because, like I said, Ben Kuebrich started talking about Afrikka's case, and he seemed really invested in it. He seemed really to want to give respect to Afrikka's mother and their family and her story. But then, basically, I feel like that was almost, while he was showing respect and empathy to her mother and to the family, it was basically a stepping stone for him to transition into, this is what happened, this is what led up to Afrikka's case. But then Afrikka just kind of became a case for the rest of the podcast, if that makes sense. So Afrikka her story was now just a puzzle piece to fit inside. The last puzzle piece needed to get an algorithm that could work, get a working, complete algorithm, a computer program, a way to take mass amounts of crime data, separate it into small clusters to try and find similarities between cases, and identify possible potential serial killers in these certain areas where these clusters of similar cases are happening. And so I would say, honestly, from this telling of it, Afrikka's story doesn't matter a ton, because Afrikka's story is just basically what allows Keubrich to transition into talking about Afrikka's case in the grander scheme of the algorithm and finding Darren Vann, and how Hargrove was able to use Afrikka's case again to complete his algorithm. And I would say even more so than Afrikka's story matters is that Hargrove and Vann's stories matter, because if you're talking about literally how much of the podcast is talked about Afrikka versus Hargrove versus Vann, Afrikka's probably talked about the least. She's talked about the most in the beginning. She's pretty much the whole first episodes, 2 or 3 episodes of the podcast. But after that, she is talked about sparingly. She's just talked about as the case. She's talked about as one of the many cases that linked together into this solution to find Darren Vann. And this solution developed by Hargrove is what Keubrich gets into after he talks about Afrikka's story. He talks about Hargrove's story, how he moved up through the ranks of journalism and investigative reporting, especially, and how he was able to use FBI data and crime lists and eventually Afrikka's case to complete his grand idea, his grand algorithm. And then from that, once they use that to find Vann, to find him, they talk about his story, his motives behind it. And it's interesting because Vann actually says that after Afrikka's case, after he had killed Afrikka, that he was actually intended to lead police to him on purpose. He wanted police to find him. So what happened was that Vann was going to be one of the clients for Afrikka, and they were going to have something set up. But then what ended up happening is that basically he upset Afrikka in some way, and she struck at him, and then out of rage, Vann says to the police that his actions for Afrikka's case specifically were not premeditated. But at the same time, that's hard to believe. But anyways, he basically, out of rage, strangled her to death, first with his hands and then with an extension cord that he had on him, which, pretty convenient. He had an extension cord on him, right, when it wasn't a premeditated murder. but we'll get into that later when we talk about whose story do we believe next. So Vann's story eventually, I think, also matters in the podcast, maybe as equally, or if not more, than Afrikka's story matters, because Ben Kuebrich really dives into Vann's, also his events leading up to the murder of Afrikka, his motivations, basically why he became a serial killer, why he kept doing these killings, and how basically what he wanted from being caught by the police, which was his story getting out there. And ultimately he tells police in the interrogation, when the night that they find Vann, he tells them that he wanted to be caught because he wants to get the death penalty. He wants to be killed. His exact words were by his next birthday. So basically in less than a year, he wanted to basically skip the trial process, and he just wanted to get the death penalty, because his motives, honestly, his motives were more clear than Afrikka's motives from the way that this story was told by Keubrich, was that Vann had been going through personal struggles, and basically deaths in the family, being in and out of jail, not for his killings but for other smaller things, and how he was fed up with it, and he let his rage take over him, and that was his motivation. Whereas with Afrikka's story, it's hard to say that her story matters because we don't have a full count of her story. The most accurate, I guess, account of her story we have is from Laurie's point of view up until Afrikka moved back to Chicago, and then from Afrikka's friend, Shamika, who was the only one who knew what she was doing because Shamika was her manager. From Shamika's point of view of what was happening to Afrikka. So in that way, I'd say it's a split between the three people, Afrikka, Thomas Hargrove, and Darren Vann, whose story really matters in the end. But I think, honestly, it's safe to say that Afrikka's story is not the main piece of this podcast, not the main focus. It doesn't matter the most. So let's look at whose story do we actually believe. And I kind of got into this a little bit with whose story matters, but whose story do we actually believe in the end? Whose recount of the events that happen make the most sense and fit into basically the grand idea of what we're looking at with the whole podcast here. And to start with Afrikka's story, it is easy and also difficult to believe Afrikka's story for a couple reasons. For one, it's usually easier to believe, I'd say, the victim's story, because they're the ones that were harmed in this case, and you inherently want to believe them. You want to believe that something bad happened to them that they didn't have anything involved in. At the same time, it was Afrikka's decision to go into prostitution, as far as we know. She didn't really have choice to go into this, and that the only account we have of possibly Afrikka's motives when she moved back to Chicago and became a prostitute, the only account we have of Afrikka's story is not from her, but actually from her friend Shamika. So it's interesting because when actually Shamika is brought in initially for investigation by the police the night that Afrikka's murder happened, is that Shamika wasn't initially upfront with all the information she had. She was withholding information because she wanted to protect Afrikka in a sense, but I think more so she wanted to protect herself from potential charges for managing a prostitute, basically, because that would be illegal. So when you have someone that is initially wanting to protect themselves, instead of giving all the information they have to the police, it's a little more difficult to believe their story when they've already proven that they're not completely trustworthy. And a similar thing happened with Vann. Do we believe his story or not? Do we believe Darren Vann's story that he gave the police, that he acted mostly not on premeditated actions, not on things he thought about before, but rather off of rage, it's also hard to believe, because he tells police that his initial motivation for getting into jail was just so he could receive the death penalty and die. Basically, I guess he wanted his struggles to end outright, and his rage took him over and basically made him commit these serial killings. It's hard to believe that story, because at the same time, Darren initially goes to police and say he can talk about Afrik's case, he can talk about a few other cases, but he can't talk about all the most recent cases he's done because some of them were out of state, is what he says. And they still are unsure on the exact amount of killings that may have happened out of state, may have not ever have happened. They aren't really completely sure how many exactly are linked to Vann. But that's what he says. But then he also goes back on what he says initially, because he says he can't give police information on his most recent killings because they happened out of state. But then he actually leads the police on what they call the death march. He basically takes police through mostly Gary, also Hammond, I believe, mostly through Gary, and leads them to spots where bodies hadn't been found yet, either missing persons case or they didn't even know this person was gone at all. And he would lead the police to bodies of dead women who are either in like abandoned houses and in cellars under piles of garbage, basically. And there's no way he could possibly know where these people are and what state they were left in. He describes to the police exactly where these bodies are and how they were left there as dead bodies, which would be impossible to know unless he was the one who killed them or was at least involved in the murders. But it's more likely that he was the one that actually killed them. But since he can take police to killings that happened recently enough that the bodies are still not fresh, but the bodies are still rotting, they're not completely gone, they've died within a recent time, that are within the same city and not out of state, within the same city that he was convicted in, it's hard to say that he's completely telling the truth and giving up all the information he has to the police truthfully and not withholding anything or not twisting the story. So it's hard to believe either side of the story, I guess. I would say it's definitely easier to believe Afrikka's side of it, although we do have technically less information on Afrikka's side of the story than Vann's story, but Vann's story, he's shown, is to be less trusted, it's less reliable, it's more shaky than Afrikka's story, which was just that she had become a prostitute and went to Gary to meet these clients, and her last client ended up killing her. Her last client of the day ended up strangling her to death and leaving her in the motel where they met up at. So while Afrikka's point of view is not told from her, rather from Shamika, and Shamika has also been shown to be a little not trustworthy. I think in the end, once she got past that, she was being upfront with the police. It's easier to believe Afrikka's story than to believe Vann's story, that it was completely out of range, that he wasn't planning on it, and as opposed to, if you don't believe Afrikka's story, then basically she would have done something, or Shamika would have done something that would have caused Vann to go and kill her, or to someone to get Vann to kill her, basically. That her death was something that she or Shamika brought upon herself. And I personally don't believe that story. I would believe Afrikka's story more than that one, that she got mixed up in Vann and not the other way around. So in the end, who gets justice for this story? I would say there's three main people, I guess four if you count Vann, but I don't think Vann really gets justice from this story the way Keubrich tells it. There's basically three different people who could get justice. You're looking at Afrikka, the victim. You're looking at her mother, Lori Townsend, who you could also say is a victim of the crime. She's affected by the crime. And you're looking at another person that I'll name in a bit, who I think actually gets the most justice from this story. But let's take a look at Afrikka. Does Afrikka really get justice in this story? Who gets justice in the end? I would say that she gets a little bit of basically of justice, of credibility from Keubrich telling her story, the way that it's told, because he interviews Lori. He gets the interviews between the police and Shamika. He gets the interviews with Hargrove. He gets the interviews with Vann. He gets all this data, all this talking and representing of the story from people who were inside of it besides Hargrove, but everyone else was on the inside of the story basically. And he gets information from these people. He makes sure that Afrikka's story is told with respect, but at the same time, it's not the main goal of the podcast is not to focus on Afrikka's story, but rather to focus on, again, this algorithm that Hargrove had developed to try and find Vann, the serial killer. So in the end, while Afrikka's story was told and while it was expressed to people and basically the word got out about what had happened and what police are now doing to try and stop these serial killings from happening in great capacity as they used to, while she does get that sense of justice from it, at the same time, she's not the focus of the podcast. And so I would say there's a little bit of not necessarily discredit, because it's not like Keubrich intends for her to be the goal, because the podcast is named Algorithm. But at the same time, the podcast isn't about her. She's more so just a case. After the first couple episodes, she's just a case that fits into the larger scheme, the larger puzzle. She's a missing puzzle piece to Hargrove and Vann's story, and in that way she gets partial but not total justice from this telling of the story. And maybe you could say that her mother Lori gets a little bit more justice from this, because what Lori said when she was interviewing with Keubrich is that she doesn't want this to happen to other people. She wants this telling of the story. She wants this telling of the story to reach people and to show that the police, while the police could have done more in that case, they are trying to do more now to stop these serial killings from happening. And I guess you could say she gets justice because she was correct on her initial suspicions, that the way that Ben Kuebrich looks at this case is that the police could have and should have done more, not necessarily to prevent Afrikka's death, but to prevent a lot of these serial killings from happening. And that is what Lori basically wants to get out, was that her daughter's case, while it was a tragedy and it was obviously very traumatic to her and to her family, Afrikka's case was instrumental in being able to stop cases like this from happening in as large a capacity as they were in the 90s and the early 2000s, which is, again, a double-edged sword, because it's good that she was proven right, that her daughter was able, while it was a tragedy and a horrific case, it was able to improve outcomes for people in the end and make sure that not as many cases like that happened again. But at the same time, you don't want to think of your daughter's case as something, it could have not happened. Something could have been done about it initially or before to prevent or stop cases like Afrikka's happening, and you don't want to think that your daughter's death could have been prevented. So it goes both ways, I'd say, from her mother's point of view, the way that Keubrich tells this story. But then I would say the person that actually gets the most justice, I guess the most reward from this storytelling that Keubrich does, is Thomas Hargrove, the guy who worked for years trying to develop this algorithm, and that is the main focus of the podcast. Hence, that's why it's titled Algorithm, is that Hargrove is the main focus throughout the entire story, throughout the entire podcast. He is the one that's able to fit the puzzle pieces together, that's able to take Afrikka's case, link it to Vann, and stop these serial killings from happening. And so in that way, Hargrove basically gets I guess it shows that he earned the respect that he should have gotten, because initially the police didn't want to work with him. The Gary police didn't want to work with him with this algorithm because they thought it was no good, I guess. They were understaffed, which is understandable that they don't have the time basically to pay attention to someone trying to draw stretches, it seems like, to draw parallels between recent cases and old cases that have already gone cold. They don't have the time, and they don't want to take the time, especially, or resources, to investigate how all these cases linked, because a lot of them were cold cases. And so I guess this telling of the podcast, is telling the story, shows that Hargrove should have been given more respect, that his algorithm was actually the key to being able to stop these serial killings and to solve these connections between crimes within, basically take all this massive crime data, separate it into clusters of similar cases, and then be able to see how these similar cases are linked together. Is that Hargrove is, I guess, the one in the end that was proven right. He was the one that Keubrich is focusing on, his algorithm, his story, while his actual story is told only in a small portion in the middle of the podcast. The results, the outcome of his story, is throughout the entire podcast. It's shown throughout, and it is the main focus of the podcast. So when you say who gets justice, Afrikka, you could say, Afrikka Hardy gets some justice just from her story being told in general. Lori Townsend, Afrikka's mother, gets some justice because she was also proven right, and that she was shown that Afrikka's case, while it was horrible, was necessary in solving the algorithm that is helping and has helped stop other serial killers and stop similar cases from happening. But in the end, Hargrove gets the most justice from the way that Keubrich tells the story, because he is, again, the main focus of the podcast. He's the one that is able to, I guess, solve the mystery. He's the one that is able to justify the wrongdoings that have happened via Vann and other serial killings. He's basically the hero of the story, and he's the one that gets justice in the end. So while this is, I enjoyed the podcast. It's called Algorithm. It's a good podcast. It's a good overall telling of all the stories that mesh into the one story that is the story of the algorithm. The telling of multiple stories that mesh together to fit this ultimate, basically, enhancer for the way that police investigate crime, for criminal investigation. And so in the end, this isn't really a story about Afrikka Hardy. It's a story about Hargrove's algorithm.